Hello, my friends. We are now deep into the Christmas season, and that reality is shaping the rhythm of politics and policy making in Europe as much as it shapes anything else. But the last 24 hours have delivered consequential developments, and they deserve careful attention because they expose, in unusually stark fashion, the financial, legal, and political limits that are tightening around the European Union's Ukraine policy, and they also clarify how the war itself is continuing to drive those limits. The long-running European saga over a proposed 140 billion financing package for Ukraine, secured, in theory, by frozen Russian sovereign assets held at Euroclear, has effectively collapsed. A late, exhausting meeting in Brussels ended not with the clean, triumphant announcement Germany's leadership had tried to engineer, but with a drastically altered arrangement. Ukraine is to receive funding on a smaller scale, structured through a complex mechanism tied to alleged budgetary leeway within the EU's central budget, supplemented by member state guarantees while explicitly carving out non-liability for a small block of dissenters. Let's be precise about what this means. First, the headline figure is no longer 140 billion, but roughly 90 billion. Second, and more important, the frozen Russian assets themselves are not to be seized as collateral or activated as security in the way the original proposal required. They remain frozen, yes, but untapped. That single fact changes the entire political story. Germany's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has taken a major public blow. So has the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Ukraine's leadership expected more, and the very architecture of the earlier plan was designed to avoid direct, visible, taxpayer-backed liability inside the EU. This new outcome does the opposite. It pushes liabilities back toward European states and inevitably European taxpayers. It also delivers clear wins to the leaders who fought to block misappropriation of Russian sovereign assets. Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever, Hungary's Viktor Orban, and their aligned partners who insisted on legal and financial risk limits. The political humiliation is not cosmetic. The original scheme was built on a bold premise that Europe could borrow on markets by invoking frozen Russian assets as a form of security, thus shifting the optics from European taxpayers fund Ukraine to Russian money funds Ukraine. The Russians, for their part, warned that any outright seizure would be treated as theft and would trigger legal retaliation and broader consequences. The plan's collapse reveals that behind closed doors, enough EU leaders and enough institutional actors judge the legal and systemic risks too high. And that risk calculus matters. If you have to build a Baroque mechanism to make an act seem lawful that would otherwise be unlawful, you are not making the unlawful lawful, you are advertising its underlying illegality. That has been the core vulnerability of these schemes from the beginning. Euroclear signaled danger. The European Central Bank signaled danger. The IMF reportedly signaled danger. Belgium, which hosts Euroclear and therefore sits at the nerve center of this entire issue, resisted the move because it would place Belgian institutions and the Eurozone's financial credibility in the crosshairs. As soon as the practical consequences of activating those assets became unavoidable counter-seizures, legal judgments, reputational damage to European custodianship, and systemic uncertainty, Europe backed away. Now, the new funding arrangement, here is why Ukraine's leadership may find it far less satisfying than the headline suggests. Under the prior 140 billion plan, it was openly discussed that 40 billion would be used to refinance or repay an earlier EU loan to Ukraine that had matured. If that remains true, and it is hard to see how it would not, then the 90 billion is not a pure infusion. It is a split, roughly 40 billion to backfill previous obligations, leaving about 50 billion as net new funds available for Ukraine's 2026 budget. Under that logic, the difference is dramatic. Instead of a possible 100 billion net infusion in 2026 under the previous scheme, Ukraine may now be looking at roughly half that amount. And even that assumes no additional internal offsets, conditions, or delays. This is not a minor adjustment. It is a rescaling of expectations at a moment when Ukraine's budget holes are widening, not shrinking. Even if 50 billion arrives quickly, perhaps in January, it is questionable whether it carries Ukraine through the summer. The fiscal pressures have not stabilized, they are intensifying. Tax revenue is fragile. Wartime spending is enormous. Infrastructure and energy damage create recurring emergency costs. At best, this arrangement buys time. It does not solve the structural problem. Ukraine's war economy remains dependent on external financing that is becoming politically and financially harder to raise. And that brings us back to the European side of the ledger. The reason the Russian assets as collateral concept gained traction in the first place is that Europe was struggling to keep finding new ways to fund Ukraine without triggering domestic backlash, constitutional constraints, or market skepticism. Merz himself resisted the idea of joint borrowing Eurobonds, effectively because it would require a deeper political commitment and, in practice, a German guarantee. The original proposal attempted to bypass precisely that. Now the bypass has failed, and Europe is creeping back toward the very option it claimed it wanted to avoid. That is the hard financial truth. If Ukraine needs continued support beyond this package, and the logic of the war suggests it will, then EU member states will face a narrowing set of choices. Either they dig into national budgets more directly politically, or they move toward expanded joint borrowing arrangements, politically and legally controversial, especially in Germany, or they begin to ration support and force Ukraine into sharper trade-offs. Accounting magic can stretch a budget only so far before markets start to discount the story. And markets do not need to take sides in a war. They only need to calculate risk. This is also why the humiliation for Germany's chancellor is deeper than a bad headline. He publicly associated himself with a scheme pitched as financially clever and politically painless. It was neither. Reports indicate the complexity of the proposal alienated even sympathetic leaders who do not like being cornered into endorsing something they do not fully understand, especially when the downside risk is open-ended. When major states like France and Italy indicate skepticism, and when smaller states resist being dragged into unlimited guarantees, the mood shifts quickly. If a plan depends on a fragile consensus, and that consensus breaks, the author of the plan does not merely lose the vote, he loses authority. Now consider the legal front. Russia has already signaled legal action and has begun proceedings in its own arbitration venues. The Europeans' decision to keep assets frozen indefinitely without seizing them does not make the issue disappear. It freezes the dispute in place, and it leaves a constant legal and political tripwire beneath any future attempt to activate those assets. If Europe ever tries again, Russia will point to Europe's own internal doubts, statements from officials, warnings from institutions, and the demonstrated fact that leaders previously backed off when confronted with the risks that record once created is powerful evidence that the risk was known and the legality was contested. In parallel, the war itself is continuing, and it is driving these financial dilemmas. Russian military leadership has delivered lengthy briefings, and the Russian president has been fielding extended public questions and media inquiries. The broad message coming from Moscow is consistency. Objectives have not softened. The narrative being presented is that Russia's demands correspond not to a pause or a compromise, but to a framework sometimes described as Istanbul Plus, a harder position than the near agreement discussed in early Landschaftsarchivar, and one that includes claims over territories Moscow now treats as integral. On the battlefield, claims and counterclaims continue in areas like Kupiansk and along the Oskol River line. The fog of war remains dense, videos are contested, geolocations disputed, and propaganda incentives are real. But the strategic intent matters at least as much as tactical disputes. The Russian side signals an intent to hold key positions, clear pockets on vulnerable riverbanks, and then resume a westward push toward objectives such as Izium and Balaklia, towns Russia once held and later lost during Ukraine's 2022 offensive. Whether those specific timelines are accurate is less important than the declared operational logic. Consolidate, eliminate exposed pockets, then advance. Elsewhere, the most consequential developments are reported around Pokrovsk and Myrnorad, as well as pressure on Kostiantynivka and the broader Donbass line. Here again, independent confirmation is uneven and sometimes absent, but the trend lines described are consistent with a larger narrative. Ukrainian units are forced into counterattacks that consume reserves, and each counterattack, if it fails, burns irreplaceable manpower and equipment. Even when counterattacks produce local tactical effects, they can still degrade Ukraine's strategic endurance. In the south, the situation in Zaporizhzhia is described as increasingly dangerous for Ukraine. Reports from Western media visits to Ukrainian drone units in the region highlight thin defenses and shortages of infantry, driven by the need to reinforce Donbass. This is where a revealing detail emerges. Incentive structures can shape reporting. If drone operators are rewarded with money or supplies based on claimed kills, that system can encourage inflated loss reporting, whether intentionally or through optimistic counting. That matters, because inflated claims are not just PR. They can distort decision-making, fuel false expectations, and delay necessary adjustments. At the same time, Russia's aerial campaign continues to target infrastructure and logistics. The pattern of strikes on bridges and energy assets around Odessa suggests a deliberate effort to isolate, disrupt supply lines, and create chronic strain blackouts, bottlenecks, and increased costs for repair and transport. Whether this is preparation for an eventual assault is speculative, but the logic of isolation and attrition is clear. You do not need to seize a city immediately to make its sustainment painful and expensive. This is why the EU's financial debate cannot be separated from the military trajectory. If Ukraine is perceived fairly or unfairly as losing ground, the political appetite to write larger checks declines. If the conflict grinds into 2026 with worsening territorial realities and escalating reconstruction costs, European leaders will struggle to sell indefinite commitments to electorates already facing industrial contraction, energy costs, and social budget stress. And that brings us to the internal European contrast that is now impossible to ignore. Germany is wrestling with deindustrialization pressures, factory closures, political instability, and contested borrowing. Britain's domestic economy is under strain as well, with reports of farming profitability collapsing under volatile weather and high input costs, fuel, fertilizer, feed costs that have been tightly linked to the broader disruption of commodity markets since the start of the war and sanctions. These are not abstract macroeconomic charts. They are lived political realities for voters. They shape elections, coalition stability, and the willingness to fund a distant war. Even the political leaders who most loudly pushed the Russian asset scheme now face the awkward consequence of Europe's retreat. Britain's government reportedly supported the concept and explored parallel moves tied to frozen Russian assets held in the UK. With the EU backing off, London's space narrows. If Europe will not risk the legal and financial blowback, Britain is unlikely to charge ahead alone, especially if banks and custodial institutions warn of systemic consequences. So, where does this leave us? It leaves Europe with a smaller Ukraine package than was advertised, built on a mechanism that shifts risk back toward European taxpayers while pretending through technical language that it is something else. It leaves Ukraine facing the likelihood that this money will not carry it far into the year. It leaves the EU confronting the probability that by early summer, the same arguments will return only under worse battlefield and budget conditions. And it leaves the Russian asset seizure concept wounded in a way that may be difficult to revive, because once leaders admit, implicitly or explicitly, that the plan is too risky, too obscure, and too legally contested, they cannot easily unsay that when the next funding crisis arrives. At some point, reality breaks through the slogans. When that moment comes, the question is not simply who will be blamed. The question is what policy options remain when the clean, painless financing tricks have failed, the war has not ended, and the domestic costs inside Europe are no longer ignorable. That is the real story of the last 24 hours. Not merely a failed scheme, but a narrowing corridor of choices financially, legally, and politically while the war continues to impose its own relentless timetable. I look at this entire episode as a stress test, not of political will, but of financial arithmetic, international law, and social endurance inside a Europe that is visibly tiring. When leaders resort to technical contrivances to disguise a simple reality that they are borrowing money in order to lend it to a bankrupt war economy, they are admitting that the easy options are gone. And when they ultimately refuse to touch the core of the scheme, the frozen sovereign assets themselves, that refusal is a quiet confession that legal boundaries and systemic risks still exist, still matter, and cannot be wished away by communiques or summit declarations. But this is the more unsettling truth. Money in war is not salvation, it is time. And time is becoming more expensive by the month. 90 billion euros sounds immense, but in a conflict of this scale, it merely buys breathing space. Each passing week deepens the budget deficit, increases replacement costs for equipment, expands energy repair demands, and transforms every assumption of a short or manageable conflict into a grinding war of attrition. At that point, the central question is no longer, can more money be found? But how many times can this request be repeated before the room starts to empty? Europe is already paying the price at home, not only through higher energy bills or slowing industrial output, but through something far more corrosive, the erosion of trust. Trust that those in charge understand the consequences of what they are doing. Trust that legal norms still mean something. Trust that fiscal prudence, once a defining European virtue, has not been permanently sacrificed to political improvisation. Once that trust cracks, markets do not need to take sides. They only need to price risk. And risk, increasingly, is being shifted from the battlefield onto the balance sheets of European taxpayers. On the battlefield itself, one dynamic remains constant regardless of maps or headlines. Momentum hardens demands. When one side believes it is advancing, compromise becomes more expensive, not cheaper. Delaying settlement does not reduce the eventual cost, it increases it. That is the brutal arithmetic of prolonged war. You do not buy a better outcome by waiting. You buy a more costly one, paid in territory, leverage, and lives. So the real question for the months ahead is not whether there will be another funding package, another summit, another declaration of resolve. There will be. The question is, when the layered realities, financial exhaustion, legal constraint, domestic political resistance, and battlefield pressure finally converge with enough force to puncture the illusion that everything remains under control. And when that moment arrives, the choice will be stark. Either Europe escalates into a deeper, clearer, and far more expensive commitment, or it begins searching for an exit, not one that preserves narratives, but one that limits damage. And that moment rarely announces itself with drama. It arrives quietly, with a smaller number than expected, a longer list of conditions, a hesitant parliament, a rising risk premium, a summit communique that sounds oddly subdued. And then, almost without warning, people begin to say aloud what they have avoided saying for far too long. This cannot continue. When that happens, the rules of the game will change not because anyone planned it, but because reality demanded it. History, as always, will not ask what was hoped for. It will record only what was done once every easy path had already closed. Europe is standing at a crossroads, and every path in front of it leads to loss. The question confronting European leaders is not whether they can avoid paying a price for the war in Ukraine, but which form of punishment they are willing to impose on their own populations and for how long they are willing to delay the inevitable. There are three options now being openly discussed within European political circles. The first is to end the war through negotiations today and accept an ugly settlement, one that exposes years of false claims, strategic miscalculations, and outright lies about Russia's supposed weakness and imminent collapse. The second is to take on massive new sovereign debt, forcing European taxpayers to continue keeping Ukraine on life support for another year or two while guaranteeing nothing but eventual defeat. The third is the most reckless, seizing Russian sovereign assets, an act that would trigger cascading consequences across global finance and geopolitics. Every one of these options is bad. There is no good outcome left for Europe, only varying degrees of damage. The war has already been lost. The only question is how much additional destruction Europe is willing to absorb in order to postpone admitting that reality. If European leaders choose negotiations now, everything they have said for 4 years collapses in full view of their own citizens. All the claims that Russia was on the brink of economic ruin, that its military was exhausted, that it could not sustain operations, all of it will be exposed as false. If they choose debt, the war still ends the same way, but at far greater cost to European economies, public services, and political stability. If they choose asset confiscation, they inherit all the consequences of the first option, plus an entirely new category of retaliation that Russia will not ignore. No matter which route is taken, Ukraine continues to bleed, Ukrainian men continue to die in a war that is already decided. The suffering intensifies not because it changes the outcome, but because it allows European elites to delay accepting responsibility for their own failure. What is driving this behavior is not strategy, it is magical thinking. European leaders understand, at some level, what the numbers say, what the battlefield realities are, and where this conflict is headed. Yet they cling to the hope that something irrational will intervene. Perhaps Russia's leadership will suddenly collapse. Perhaps an internal crisis will magically end the war. Perhaps some unpredictable event will rescue them from the consequences of their own decisions. Yes, in human affairs, there is always a non-zero chance of the unexpected. But basing policy on a probability that approaches zero is not leadership, it is delusion. When a strategy requires a miracle to succeed, it has already failed. The overwhelming likelihood is not a favorable surprise, but a crushing defeat for Ukraine first and for Europe soon after. Inside the European Union, this reality is producing visible fractures. Public declarations of unity conceal intense internal resistance. Medium and small-sized European states, which have little interest in this war and no desire to bankroll its continuation, are increasingly unwilling to sign on to either more debt or asset seizures. The language of solidarity rings hollow when the costs are permanent and the benefits non-existent. The debate over confiscating Russian assets exposes how dangerous this path truly is. These funds are largely frozen in jurisdictions that would bear direct responsibility for the seizure. Officials in those countries understand that this would not be a symbolic gesture, it would be a direct act with real consequences. The assumption that Russia has no leverage left, no tools for retaliation, is not merely wrong, it is reckless. Russia has never operated on the principle of absorbing punishment indefinitely. Historically, its response has been proportional and deliberate. The post-Cold War period, when Russia was weak and unable to respond meaningfully to Western encroachment, created a false sense of permanence in Western capitals. That era is over. Anyone who failed to learn that lesson in 2008, in 2014, or in 2022 has chosen willful blindness. This is not the Russia of the 1,990 seconds. The belief that Moscow will accept asset seizures without retaliation is fantasy. Russia has options, economic, legal, diplomatic, and strategic, that Europe prefers not to think about. Confiscation would invite responses that European leaders are neither prepared for nor capable of controlling. At the same time, Europe is openly admitting its financial exhaustion. Senior officials have effectively conceded that without access to Russian funds, Europe cannot sustain Ukraine militarily or economically beyond the near term. This alone reveals the truth. Europe is already out of money. And yet, while acknowledging this reality, European governments simultaneously announce massive military expansion plans. They speak of raising defense spending to levels not seen since the Cold War, expanding troop numbers, and building the largest armies on the continent, all while their economies stagnate, their energy costs soar, and their public services are cut. These ambitions are detached from reality. For decades, European states struggled to meet even minimal defense spending targets. Now, in the midst of economic strain largely caused by self-inflicted sanctions and the loss of cheap Russian energy, they promise a sudden leap to unprecedented military expenditure. This is not planning, it is political theater. Europe's economic foundation has already been damaged. Cheap energy once fueled industrial growth and social stability. That advantage has been deliberately discarded. Dependency has not disappeared. It has simply shifted at a much higher cost. Growth has slowed or turned negative. Public frustration is rising. Governments that once prided themselves on social protection now struggle to maintain basic services. Against this backdrop, leaders propose either deeper debt or outright asset seizure, both of which further weaken their own economies. And for what? Money does not change the fundamental reality of this war. Wars are not won by spreadsheets. They're won by men. And Ukraine does not have them. No amount of funding can fix the manpower crisis on the Ukrainian side. Casualties, desertions, and exhaustion continue to shrink the force month after month. Lowering the draft age will not reverse this. It will simply accelerate the human catastrophe. Sending barely trained teenagers into a modern battlefield does not prolong victory. It magnifies tragedy. Even if Europe succeeds in raising the funds, the battlefield outcome remains unchanged. Russia has already achieved strategic dominance. Continued funding only increases the scale of loss for Ukraine and for Europe without altering the conclusion. Extend the war another year, and the consequences multiply. Hundreds of thousands more Ukrainians dead or wounded. Entire generations lost. Europe burdened with deeper debt, weaker economies, and growing political instability. Eventually, there will be no more Russian assets to seize. No new loans that do not threaten collapse. And then Europe arrives at the same decision it faces today, only in a far worse position. Negotiations now are ugly. Negotiations later may not exist at all. The longer Europe delays, the closer it moves toward a scenario where the only terms available are dictated entirely by military reality, possibly from inside Kyiv itself. This is the central truth. European leaders refuse to confront. The war is already over in strategic terms. The only variable left is how much additional suffering they are willing to impose before admitting it. Money will not change the battlefield. Machines will not change the battlefield. Without men, none of it matters. Europe can pay more to lose, or it can choose the only rational option left, ending the war on the best terms still available. Every alternative is worse. That is where we are. And here's the part European leaders refuse to say out loud. Because once you say it, you can't unsay it. This is no longer a war being managed for victory. It's a war being managed for optics. It's being prolonged so careers can survive, so press conferences can sound brave, so failed policies can be dressed up as principle. And so the people paying the bill, Ukrainians first, Europeans next, don't fully grasp how thoroughly they've been played. Because if you strip away the slogans, the flags, the rehearsed moral lectures, what's left is brutally simple. Ukraine is being asked to bleed to protect the reputations of men and women who will never stand in a trench. And Europe is being asked to bankrupt itself to protect the illusion that it can still dictate outcomes on Russia's border. That's what this has become, a credibility operation, a face-saving exercise, a bureaucratic addiction to doubling down. And the most dangerous part is this: the West keeps acting as if time is a weapon it controls, as if postponing reality is the same thing as defeating it, as if another 6 months, another tranche of money, another package, another conference, another headline will somehow reverse physics, reverse logistics, reverse demographics, reverse the industrial math of war. It won't. Time doesn't obey press releases. Time doesn't answer to European councils. Time answers to factories, to manpower pools, to ammunition rates, to terrain, to adaptation. And Russia has adapted, expanded, and stabilized in ways the West pretended were impossible. That's why every option Europe is debating is a poisoned cup. Negotiations expose the lie. Debt delays the lie. Seizing assets internationalizes the lie and triggers retaliation that Europe is not built to withstand. The elites are trying to choose between humiliation now, pain later, or chaos on top of both. And they're shocked that there isn't a fourth option where they get to keep their narrative intact and still escape the consequences. There isn't. So, what happens next? Here's the likely path, and it's ugly. Europe will continue to argue, continue to posture, continue to talk about solidarity while quietly panicking about the bill. They'll threaten Russia with confiscation and sanctions, then quietly discover that the rest of the world is watching China, India, the Gulf states, Africa, Latin America, watching to see whether European property rights mean anything at all. Because if Europe normalizes the idea that sovereign reserves can be stolen when politics demands it, then every country with money parked in Western systems learns the same lesson. Your assets are only safe until you disagree. And that lesson, once learned, doesn't unlearn. It reshapes global finance for decades. Meanwhile, the battlefield will keep producing the only kind of truth that matters in war. Irreversible facts. Villages taken. Supply lines cut. Units depleted. Morale eroded. The slow grind of attrition that doesn't care about speeches. And if Europe chooses to pour more money in, it won't buy victory, it will buy time. And that time will be purchased with Ukrainian bodies. That is the moral stain at the center of this entire project, and it will not wash out, because here's what's coming if this drags on. Ukraine will be pushed toward ever more desperate mobilization. Older men, then younger men. Eventually, the political class will start floating the unthinkable as if it's necessary. 18-year-olds rush training fantasy solutions. And the results will be exactly what any serious military analyst already knows. More dead, more wounded, more shattered families, and an even weaker position when the final settlement arrives anyway. That's not defense. That's liquidation. And Europe? Europe will discover what happens when you sacrifice cheap energy, industrial competitiveness, and social stability for an ideological crusade you cannot sustain. You will get unrest. You will get political fragmentation. You will get governments falling. You will get anger that doesn't politely stay inside ballot boxes. The people will not accept permanent austerity, so Brussels can pretend it's standing tall on Russia's border. They will not accept collapsing services, so someone in a suit can say, we showed resolve. And so in the end, the real question is not whether Europe will pay the price. The price is guaranteed. The question is whether Europe pays it in a controlled way now by admitting reality, negotiating, stopping the bleeding, or whether it pays it later in a chaotic way after it has exhausted Ukraine's manpower, hollowed out its own economies, and triggered wider retaliation through asset theft and escalation. That's the choice. And it's as stark as it sounds. You can end this now and swallow the bitter truth that Russia has already won the war that matters, the war of strategic endurance. Or you can keep feeding the furnace, keep pretending, keep gambling on miracles until there is no negotiation left, only surrender terms dictated by force and geography and the cold logic of who can sustain war and who cannot. And history will remember it exactly as it is, not as a noble struggle, not as a triumph of values, but as a catastrophic failure of leadership leaders who chose pride over people, narrative over life, and illusion over peace.